Instead of focusing on winning arguments, we're teaching the basic fundamentals of sales and marketing and how we can use them to win in the world of politics, teaching you how to meet people where they're at on the issues they care about. Welcome to The Brian Nichols Show. Hey there, folks. Brian Nichols here on another fun-filled episode, of The Brian Nichols Show. I am, as always, your humble host, joining you from our lovely Cardio Miracle Studios here in sunny Eastern Indiana. The Brian Nichols Show is powered by, the best heart health supplement in the world, Cardio Miracle. If you want to learn how to lower your resting heart rate, lower your blood pressure while improving your pump at the gym, stick around. We'll talk about that later, more in today's episode. But first, we're discussing all things homelessness. We're seeing literally billions of dollars being tossed at the problem. And I don't know, I don't really see things getting better. So we got to discuss today, what is the best way to help solve homelessness? And would what Washington, D.C. has discussed doing, destroying homeless encampments, be a solution, or is it going to be more of a problem? Joining me here to discuss all that and more is Susannah Petitt. Susannah, welcome to the Brian Nichols Show. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much for having me on.
Great to have you on the show, Susannah. Looking forward to digging into all things homelessness, solutions, and more. But before we do that, do me and the audience a favor. Introduce yourself here to the Brian Nichols Show audience.
Yeah, so I'm Susannah. I'm a program manager in economic policy here in DC. And I also am a social mobility fellow with Young Voices. And most of my work focuses on social mobility and how policy affects families and women specifically.
Okay, perfect. Well, and we're going to talk all things about how policy impacts, in this case, lots and lots and lots of people. And that number seems to be growing more and more and more. And that is the homelessness, what is it, epidemic? Call it what you will, but lots of weird stuff going on in that world, Susannah. Give us the lay of the land. What's happening here?
Yeah, so homelessness is definitely a crisis. Since 2016, homelessness has increased almost 30% across the U.S. In D.C., homelessness this past year actually fell. So what inspired me to write this piece in Greater Washington was participating in the D.C. point in time count, which is done in all jurisdictions that receive federal homelessness funding. They go and they manually count every person that is sleeping on the streets. And then there's also a group that goes and counts people who are in shelters. So you go out at like 1 a.m., you interview people who are sleeping on the streets, ask them if they're veterans, if they've ever been addicted to drugs, if they have children, try to get demographic information about them. And I felt like I learned a lot about homelessness because of talking to the people actually experiencing homelessness. And since homelessness is on the rise, I felt like it was a really important conversation to have, to actually give them a voice and to share that with people who maybe only think about the numbers behind homelessness and not those faces.
Well, and let's dig a little bit deeper here. You had these one-on-one conversations with folks. What did you hear? What were some of the main reasons people were homeless?
It really varies. Some people are indeed, the data shows that about 75% of the chronically homeless, so people who routinely return to the streets and are unable to maintain a steady job or steady home, have some sort of serious mental illness or have a substance abuse problem. And many people experiencing chronic homelessness have both. And that was true of some of the people I talked to. They either were drug addicts, they were former drug addicts who were trying to get clean, or they had some sort of mental health problem. One of the women that I spoke to, she was also escaping domestic violence, which is very common, especially for women. And she had kids with her as well. So she was fleeing with herself and her children, which is more common for women. But some of it also is just people who don't have as large of a savings or a safety net. And by safety net, I mean like family, friends who can take them in if they experience an economic shock, like a job loss, or if they get evicted and there isn't a place that they can stay or people who can kind of fill that gap. They're also likely to end up on the streets, but those aren't typically the chronically homeless.
So let's address the biggest elephant in the room, because we hear this a lot, right? Like, well, Susannah, we've watched billions of dollars be tossed at this problem. Look at California. I forget the specific number. They've tossed like tens of billions of dollars, I believe, at these problems. And then you see, I forget the man in the street interview, but there was some guy out in, I think it was San Francisco, and he's doing like this man in the street interview where he's like asking people how much money they earn and how they accomplished it. And he starts talking to this one lady, and she proudly promotes that she is an executive who is trying to help solve the homelessness crisis in California. And then he was asking how much she made, and it was high six figures. And you hear this and you're like, wait, hold on. timeout. So we're tossing billions of dollars at this problem. We have people who are trying to help, air quote, solve this problem, making like hand over fist dollars and cents that otherwise likely wouldn't be there if it were not for the gravy train from the government. So how do we actually solve this? Because you look at the very real, like the outcomes of us attempting to solve it, and it's not leading to any positive outcomes. But I know we just can't sit on our hands and hope things are going to get better. So what's the actual solution here?
Solutions are hard, right? And you're so right about the government spending. The government spent about $4 billion on anti-homelessness efforts last year. Compared to 2007, that was $1.4 billion. So over 20 years, this just keeps growing and increasing, and it's likely to continue both at the federal and state level. If you kind of expand out and you look at the overall war on poverty, $22 trillion has been spent on anti-poverty efforts since 1964.
That's it? Wow.
I know, it doesn't seem like as much, but if you think about if you break that down to the individual, in 2023, the government is spending $29,000 per individual on anti-poverty efforts. So it's a lot of money per person for nothing to be happening, right? People are still on the streets. People are still stuck in poverty. And some of this is because government does Band-Aid solutions that look really good. We see in New York that the Democrat mayoral candidate ran on a platform of rent control, right? Like these are the things that governments believe are useful. A lot of places that suffer with chronic homelessness and large homelessness problems, so urban areas, have a housing first approach, which just aims to get people in homes, but doesn't address the mental illness or the substance abuse problems that are actually keeping people on the streets, and just hopes to put a roof over their heads. And while that's good, it does nothing to actually prevent them from then going back on the streets. So this goal of permanent supportive housing is just doing something that feels good and is really expensive. I think in San Francisco, it costs like $750,000 per housing unit to create these permanent supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness in San Francisco. That's not sustainable, right? Like governments can't build enough housing for the poor and the homeless, and then there is no support for those experiencing substance abuse, mental illness, and physical illnesses that maybe land people on the streets. And there is studies that show that when people are put in these permanent supportive housing units, they actually have higher rates of drug use. If you are trying to get clean and then you're put in a community of other addicts or former addicts, you're much more likely to relapse, especially if you don't have support from professionals. If you have a mental health crisis, a lot of times people who are struggling with severe mental health issues like severe bipolar disorder, severe schizophrenia, they end up being more socially isolated when they're in these supportive housing units. So they're all completely counter to what the government says the goal is. And it's just to say, oh, well, we got people off the streets, but they did nothing to solve the actual root problem of why people were on the streets.
Well, two things, right? And this goes to maybe an objection / a solution I've heard touted, and I want to get your feedback, because you go back to the 60s and 70s, and we saw a great government proposal. I'm saying great from a scale standpoint, a large government proposal to end mental institutions. And we see a direct correlation between the ending of mental institutions and the rise of homelessness. And a lot of it seems to be the very folks you're outlining here today, the people who are suffering from mental issues, the people who are suffering from drug abuse. And those mental institutions were the areas that, yes, I hear the argument, like they were not going there voluntarily. They were being forced to go to these mental institutions. But you look at where we are today, are they objectively in a better spot now? Because they have, call it freedom, call it liberty, call it what you will, but now they're living on the streets in squalor, in horrible conditions. Not to say that the mental institutions were glowing and great. Like I think of the Willowbrook story back. That was where Geraldo Rivera got his big break, was going and exposing the horrors that were taking place at Willowbrook. And if folks are unaware of that, go check that out. It's really just, it is eye-opening. And I used to work in a mental health facility up in northern New York. So we were actually required to learn the history of Willowbrook and how horribly those with severe mental disabilities were treated. But you look to where some of these other folks are, they don't necessarily have severe mental disabilities, like truly debilitating disabilities, but rather it is, more of I'm going to call it the functioning disabilities, right? The mental health issues, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and then you mentioned the drug abuse side of things. So the argument I've heard from a lot of folks, and I'll position this to you, is Susannah, do you see something of a solution that could incorporate going back to the solution that we saw work? I'm using it very loosely, that word work, but it did keep the streets cleaner, safer, and I would say, objectively speaking, compare and contrast to where we are today, take those homeless individuals and at least give them a place where we know they're not going to be in the streets, exposed to the elements and all the other mayhem that would come from that. So is that a viable solution in your book? And if not, what would be a better one? If you're a new parent, you already know the feeling. Running on maybe 3 hours of sleep, chasing your kid before the coffee kicks in. It's like you're constantly in survival mode. And even if you do find time to eat clean or sneak in a workout, your body's just not operating at full speed. Stress, sleepless nights, and poor nutrition tank your nitric oxide levels, leaving you sluggish, foggy, and unfortunately snapping at the people you love the most. And trust me, I've been there. That's why I started using Cardio Miracle. That's a clean nitric oxide blend that supports energy, circulation, and mood with no caffeine crashes or stimulants. Just ingredients like organic beetroot, CoQ10, and L-arginine that naturally help you stay present, productive, and powered through parenthood. Trust me, this stuff helps you show up for your family. So, scan the little QR code over my shoulder, click the link in the show notes, or simply head to cardiomiracle.com/TBNS to give it a try. And by the way, when you go to cardiomiracle.com/TBNS, you're going to get a discount automatically applied at checkout. Just look for the little note saying you're shopping with Brian Nichols at the Cardio Miracle homepage. One more time, that's cardiomiracle.com/TBNS. And now, let's get back to the show.
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely right. Like the closing of and the ending of involuntary admission into mental health facilities has definitely contributed to the rise in homelessness. And it's hard to say if that's good or bad because some of these places are horrific. But then by preventing people from going to any mental health facility at all, you are not allowing them access to care. So you aren't allowing people who have these more treatable mental health problems, like people with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, can, with the right medications and therapies, live a fully productive life and be fully integrated into society instead of being kept out like they are because of homelessness. And so this shift away from real mental health care and kind of promoting, oh, well, we'll put them in shelters and they will get better, has really hurt the people it was aiming to help. And so this is where I think the role of private charities step in. There's a lot of great examples of private organizations that first establish a relationship, because since it's illegal to take people off the streets, and maybe that's the right solution, right? Of people can go and send and take someone into a mental institution because sometimes that's what they need. I live in DC. I go out with my friends, and sometimes you see people in crisis and your option is to call the police and then they go to jail. They don't go to a place that they can get help. They go to jail overnight and then they're put back on the street the next day. And that just continually happens, right? Instead of being able to call, say, a mental health facility and ask for them to come help this person who's experiencing crisis and who is in psychosis. And there's examples of privately owned charities that first establish relationships with people who are on the streets and help them want to come into care. Because a lot of people who are experiencing severe mental health crises view people who are trying to help them as people who are trying to hurt them. So you can go up to them, and I saw this in my experience on the pit count. You go up to them, you say, I have food for you, I have water, I have a blanket, and they're very adverse to going. They see you as, whether it's because of what is happening in their head or because of what they've experienced, they don't see you as someone who can help, which is where some of this involuntary, the removal of involuntary, I don't want to say like locking them up or anything, like providing them with help without them consenting to it was valuable, because if they are in such a place where they can't see help as helpful, then there's really nothing that can be done. And so I think there's two sides that you can say, yes, it'd be good to have some sort of way to involuntarily bring people into mental health care, but maybe it shouldn't be done through state-run facilities.
Interesting. So let's dig a little bit deeper into that, the differences between the state-run facilities and the private ones, because I guess the number one question I would be asking as a member of the audience, and by the way, as host, I'm going to ask this question, is, well, I mean, what I guess fundamentally is going to be the difference from those private institutions versus the public institutions in involuntarily committing somebody because they have mental health issues? I mean, at the end of the day, both will require, in some essence, force, right? Whether that's force from a government official, holding a gun, or it's going to come from a force from a private actor holding, I don't know, a baton, a straitjacket, whatever it may be. But the outcome is, in essence, to your point, it is putting that person into a position where they are not voluntarily, going to seek help and treatment, and in this case, a roof over their head, but rather it's something that we are acknowledging fundamentally, that this person is not in a position to not only take care of themselves, but now they're actually putting themselves in a position where they could potentially harm others. And that's the other piece too. We see the mental health crisis that is now impacting people just walking on the streets. You mentioned what you saw in DC. I lived in Philadelphia for just shy of a decade. I saw it firsthand myself. And it was very eye-opening, very sad, but also very scary. Because if I'm a person, raising a family in a big metro city like a Philadelphia or a Washington, D.C. or elsewhere, I would never want my family to be there, because I don't know that person is going to be in a mental state to be safe to my family. So I'm not even going to put my family in a position to potentially get harmed. So what happens? They move out. All these families, these folks who have the ability, move out of these cities. They say, I'm not going to live there. I'm going to go live in the suburbs, or I'm going to live in the country. I can commute if I need to, or I'm going to, use my laptop and work remote. And they just, they're out of there. But also what's happening is now you're seeing the tax base leave. So the tax base leaves. Now there's less money to go towards these services. And by the way, I would argue that I watch in Philadelphia, my money being put, to your point, services that were not tangibly actually solving problems, but if anything, exacerbating the issues. So I guess it really just comes down to, like, do we as a society need to have some very tough conversations around, dare I say, reality? Because that to me, it kind of feels like where we are, where we have one side of the aisle who is this bleeding heart, like, oh, these poor people, they just need help. And then the other side saying, that's great, they need help, but they're also causing real damage and harm. And if there is any argument for a government, it is to say, government, your role is to stop people who could cause harm from causing harm. Like, that, I think that's really where it comes down to. Am I off base there?
So I would describe myself as like a bleeding heart classical liberal, right? Like, I have this like deep, I see these people, and I had these conversations when I was on the pit count that really influenced my thinking about homelessness. But also I get how government is failing. And one of the men I spoke to, we spoke to him for probably 20, 25 minutes. And he was saying that he had been on the wait list for 3 years. So he had been on the streets for 18, had been on the wait list for public housing for 3 years, and kept getting bumped. And he was like, I've been trying to do everything. I'm clean. It gets harder and harder every day to stay clean, but the government won't do anything. They don't care.
Really quick, can you dig deeper into that? Why is it harder for him to stay clean?
Because he's on the streets. So you're surrounded by people who are using drugs. For example, the pit count happens in January, and DC had a huge snowstorm, and all the shelters were full. And so he had to sleep on the streets through like 2-3 feet of snow. And he was talking about, he's like, you want something that keeps you warm and gives you hope. And sometimes drugs are the only thing on the streets. He's like, I'm really fighting to stay clean. And he said that snowstorm was one of the hardest nights for him in a long time.
And really quick, I don't mean to derail the conversation, Susannah, but like that right there, to your average person listening, they're like, dude, you're homeless and you're going to get drugs? Like, right. but I'm not saying this to be like, I'm not trying to be the foil to your bleeding heart, but as someone who's a taxpayer, I would hear that and say, dude, okay, now I'm not going to like go out of my way to spend money to make your life better, because I'm seeing the actions you're taking, and you're taking fundamentally different actions than I would with my dollars and cents. And I hear your point, right? It's hard because of who they're surrounding with, but like, does that excuse that behavior?
Definitely doesn't excuse the behavior. But I think the response to that is there's facing different incentives and different constraints. So I'm an economist. We always think about how humans act when they're set within whatever set of constraints they're facing. So I think about if I was in crisis and during that snowstorm, I had been kicked out of my home, I would be able to, worst case scenario, come to my office and sleep in my on one of the couches that's in my workplace. But I have friends that could help me in the meantime. But if he admitted he was a drug addict, which is what landed him on the streets, he lost contact with all of his friends and family, and he fought to get clean. He was in and out of rehab, state-sponsored rehab. But once he finished, there was no home for him. And so then you're trying to fight to stay clean while trying to find a job after having some sort of criminal conviction, trying to find housing while after having a criminal conviction when there isn't a lot of affordable housing, especially in DC. And then all the people around you are using drugs. And so he was talking about kind of his hope to be an entrepreneur and was asking us about how to find contacts so that he could help people build websites, because that's what he did before he struggled with drugs. He was talking about how libraries where he was trying to develop his skills were pushing him away because he wasn't clean. Shelters aren't letting him stay. So these government facilities that people point to of like, well, why aren't you using the library? Why aren't you using shelters? They're turning people away. And some of that is because the government has just created systems that are meant to support people that do very little. Mm-hmm. And they crowd out these more effective private charities that work to help families and help individuals. And so going back to your point about why the private sector is preferable in this specific case, it's both that they are demonstrated to be more effective and that they're more specific. I think of one of my colleagues, Jack Salmon, used to work at the Philanthropy Roundtable, which is a think tank that works specifically on charities. And he told me about a charity in Denver called Step Denver, that helps with homelessness. And their alumni, after leaving their program where they're required to stay sober, they're required to have a job, they're required to participate in community, 82% have jobs and 89% are in stable housing. That statistic is, for government-run programs, probably around 5%. The majority of people who are in government-run housing, government-run programs, do not leave and find a house, do not leave and find a job. And so there's just so much data that demonstrates that the private sector is better than this, and there's opportunities to be more specific. So if you are someone who has a criminal record, there's programs for you that are there. If you have a drug addiction, there's programs, or ideally there would be. But government, by both funding these programs, which then changes their donation structure and people don't donate to government-funded charities, or by crowding out from, I believe the government's going to fix homelessness, so I'm not going to donate to my local homeless shelter. These places that are more effective shut down. And so there's kind of this double-edged sword where the government programs are ineffective and are failing people who are living on the streets and who are trying to do better. Whether or not you think that that's true, but at least taking it at face value, right? Like hoping to get a job, hoping to stay clean of drugs. Government programs are failing while also preventing effective programs from starting or from sustaining.
So I know you mentioned, and I mean to interrupt, but I know you mentioned incentive structures here, because incentive structures are huge. But how much of that incentive structure, I'm not saying excusing away, but it does feel in certain instances we do this, where we're excusing away bad behavior because of incentive structures. And again, I get it. Like, incentive structures are important, but going back to the use case of the gentleman you talked about earlier, this all started from a bad choice, right? It was him going and getting addicted to drugs. And we see that, this, and I'm going to pick on my libertarian friends, but there was this mentality of live and let live that really has permeated the more like libertarian, and it has turned into this libertine culture where it's like, well, just because they made a choice doesn't mean it's bad or good. It's like, no, that's a bad choice. And I think we should be able to acknowledge that things are good or bad. There is a moral right and a moral wrong. And there are very real consequences from those choices. Now, the other piece of it is, how do we overcome those consequences, right? How do we react? And I have seen time and again, and I experienced this firsthand when I was in Philadelphia. One of my good friends, Frankie, she has what's called a Feed Philly. And about every month they would get together, group about 20 folks, and we would split apart through the city, and you'd go and you'd, go to the well-known homeless areas, and you'd just bring, sandwiches and stuff to feed to people. And I would have a few of those conversations with folks, and I've heard from quite a number of individuals who are like, yeah, no, I'm good. I don't need help. I'm good. I'm going to stay on the street. And this goes to, I think, an objection that folks in more of the, listen, like, we can help folks, but we can only help to the extent they want to help themselves, where folks hear that. And then you see the outcomes, to your point earlier, like, we have all these programs that are out there, and the folks who, you mentioned the private solution, where I forget the numbers, like 90%, I think you said, of success rate. That's awesome. But how much of that is due to the fact that they are the exception to the rule versus the overarching data sets that show a lot of these folks, when given alternatives, be that government or elsewhere, they do end up still going back on the streets, engaging in the bad behavior. And again, I understand the incentive structures, but like, it almost feels that we abdicate responsibility at behest of these individuals because of the circumstances in the situation they find themselves in. And then, to your point, the incentive structure is built in, versus just saying, oh, why can't we walk and chew gum at the same time? And it leads people to say, well, if I'm going to, just spend all this time, energy, and effort in trying to help somebody who doesn't want to help themselves, then why bother? If you're a business owner, do you ever open your phone bill and feel like you need a decoder ring? Regulatory recovery fee, support access surcharges, platform licensing. Half the stuff on there is just made up jargon for, we felt like charging you more, and here it is. And don't worry, other folks are over it too. And that's why I am recommending you Level 365. They're upfront, no hidden fees, no surprise line items, no games. You pay what you agreed to, period. And if you need help, a real human answers the phone. Clean pricing, real support. It shouldn't be revolutionary, but here we are.
Yeah, so that goes into what I was saying earlier when we were talking about, like, forcibly putting people into mental health facilities.
Yep.
Some of that aversion to help is their brain telling them, like, this is an enemy, this is not safe for you.
And by the way, how many of those folks would you say fill into this classification of having some type of mental health issue that they could be involuntarily
I don't know about when people were allowed to be put involuntarily into mental health facilities. I'm not sure what, like, the diagnostic criteria was for that, but, like, there was a UCLA study that said that 75% of the homeless population have some sort of serious mental health problem. So the vast majority of people who are chronically homeless, not just sleeping on the streets for one night because they're fleeing domestic violence or because they got evicted, people who are continually going back to the streets have serious mental health problems. And so these programs that are privately run are also run by people who have, like, the ability to help with the serious mental health problems. So they are targeting those who have, like, obviously people should be responsible for what they've done. Like, if you have a criminal record, if you have an addiction to drugs, you've made poor choices, but it's how our current system isn't structured to let you come back from that poor choice. And instead you're going to stay on the streets instead of finding ways to go back into society and be a productive member of your community. And so that's what I appreciate about a lot of these private efforts to reduce homelessness is they focus on reintegrating into the communities. So whether that's through running a community garden or helping with construction, they help people who have previously experienced homelessness to be able to find themselves and grow, as opposed to government programs. Like, there's in Massachusetts, which is kind of the most commonly pointed to example of, if you want public housing in Massachusetts, it's based on a point system. You have to get a certain number of points to qualify for housing. And some of that is, if you've committed a crime, you get an extra point. If you had a drug addiction, you get an extra point. That means incentivizing people to commit crimes and have drug addictions. That's a problem. What we should instead do is find these programs that look for those who are searching to change or who are willing to talk. And maybe that takes that building of relationships, but then who actually will contribute back to society, instead of creating these programs that are like, congrats, you robbed a store, we're going to provide you with a roof over your head. That's completely anti to how we could actually fix homelessness. And then, of course, those people are just going to end.
So, and really quick, Susannah, let's just like dig into these numbers here, though, because you mentioned a number, and I just want to bring this back up. So, you mentioned that 75% of folks, by and large, probably suffer from some mental health issue that are on the streets. Is that what you said before?
Yes.
So, the most recent number I saw for homeless folks, I found was January of 2024. The number was ballparked like 770,000 to 775,000 homeless individuals in America. So 75% of that number is around ballpark 575,000 people. That number is still astronomical that many people would classify under a mental health issue. So it goes back to, I think, again, this is the very hard conversation that we all kind of need to have as a society, is that the 75% number of these folks, it doesn't matter what incentives we put in place. It doesn't matter what options we present them. If they are mentally ill and they are suffering from a mental illness that's stopping them from making good choices, or outright they don't have the ability to make good choices, I mean, that does lead me to say, well, I think we need to start having, again, more of this tough conversation of saying, yep, you know what? As much as we want to do all these good things, we need to make the streets safer. And we know that if we put these options in front of these people, they're not going to make the good choice because they don't have the mental faculties to do as much. Does that make sense?
And so to clarify, based on with the point in time count, at least, I'm not sure what the methodology was for the UCLA study or the size of their sample. But when we ask on the point in time count, do you have some sort of mental health problem? It encompasses those severe mental health, psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar, but also depression, anxiety, autism, ADHD. So things that wouldn't necessarily put you in the camp of being unable to accept help. So I don't know. So that's
then what is it?
I'm sorry.
So then what is it that stops them from getting help then?
That's why I was pointing that out to indicate the access to services, right? Of if government services are unable to help someone who's really struggling with depression, possibly because they're on the streets, then that just puts them into a further trap of their depression and their inability to contribute, as opposed to effective social programs, which, some of them are focused on people who struggle with depression and suicidal ideation, and they're able to help them recover from their depression while gaining skills that maybe they would have otherwise not been able to gain while in other mental health treatment. And so I bring that up just to point out that this is the value of these private alternatives of someone who is living on the street because they have severe autism has very different needs than a woman who is escaping domestic violence. And government programs are one size fits all. And it is a massive number. And I don't think that there's zero role for government in some of these, especially like people exiting prison and who end up on the streets. Like I think or veterans. These are examples of
I have a solution. Oh my gosh, I have the solution. So tell me if I'm off base here, right? So we do a government private sector partnership. Okay. Government goes through using the strong arm of government because they are at the end of the day, the monopoly on force, right? They go through and we just, and by the way, this is obviously make believe, but this is my silly solution. We say federal government, clean up the streets. Every single homeless person, we are taking them and we're putting them into a ginormous warehouse, right? And then private health folks or private sector folks, you now have the responsibility of helping segregate the folks in the warehouse of who are the folks who are suffering from severe mental disabilities, who are the folks suffering from depression, ADHD, autism, who are the folks who are suffering from severe drug use or addiction. And then we can better help remedy the situation, because now we're actually first and foremost taking all the folks who are bad, saying the word bad, not in terms of who they are, but like bad from a societal standpoint, off the streets. And now we're putting them in a situation where, number one, there are no incentive structures to go back in the street because the government's saying no more street folks, right? But at the same point in time, now we're giving the private companies or nonprofits or whoever it may be the ability to do what they do well. And that is help the people who are willing to help themselves. And the folks who aren't, okay, here we go. Now we can have the conversation around involuntary commitment. Is that a solution? Or am I being too cavalier here?
Probably a little too cavalier.
Okay.
In the places that have tried encampment sweeps, this is what kind of spurred me to write the article, was DC started doing DC city policy is to give residents of homeless encampments, so where you see lots of tents or lots of kind of makeshift sleeping areas, give them about 2 weeks before they destroy encampments, and DC switched to giving them less than 24 hours notice. So they were just moving people into these like kind of holding spaces who were living in these encampments because Donald Trump asked the DC mayor to do so. And other places that have done these sort of encampment sweeps, all it does is it moves the problem elsewhere. So in the DC area, when encampments have been done, you see more homeless people in Arlington or outside in Maryland because the area is so interconnected.
Well, that's because they're not in the big warehouse, like I said.
Yes, but I also think these are people, right? Like they aren't, even if they have severe mental health problems, if they have drug addiction, like at the very core, like they're a person who at some point had a family and who has life experiences that have brought them to where they are. And
well, really, I gotta push back on that piece, because doesn't that mentality excuse away any really bad choices or behavior from anybody? Like, hey, that guy killed a bunch of kids, but hey, he had a family at one point and something happened, right? It's like, doesn't that kind of go down that pathway if we go down, that rabbit hole?
I think that's actually like an alternative slippery slope of saying that a person who has a drug addiction maybe had some sort of life event that spurred them to become a drug addict is supported in the data. Or same with most women who are homeless are escaping domestic violence or sexual violence. Putting people in kind of holding pens does nothing to address their real root causes of being homeless and will only kind of perpetuate the cycle of poverty. No one, even if we're then equipping private charity to come and help, you are not able to help people in the way that I think allowing private charities to go in and build those relationships and help people where they are. Instead, people will maybe be accepting help because it's that or stay in a holding pen instead of being voluntary. And
is that a bad thing?
Putting people in pens?
Well, hear me out. We're talking about people who are living on the streets, facing the elements, to your point, living in 2-3 foot of snow at points in time, right? Who also, if we're talking about the 75% number, again, 575 plus thousand people who suffer from some type of mental illness, whether it's ADHD, autism, or we're going into the the deeper ends like bipolar, schizophrenia, right? Like some of those folks are a very real danger to society. When I was in Philadelphia, I saw firsthand right there in the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, we had a ginormous homeless encampment, and it took up about 2 blocks of the street. And you walk down there, you would hear people fighting. Just the smell was horrid. And I'm just gonna say, Susannah, the argument to me that putting somebody in a warehouse where they can work now, and I'm saying temporarily, right? Like very, very temporarily, to then leverage these private sector partners to help the mom who needs the help, right? To help the guy who wants to be an entrepreneur, right? Like, but then there are folks who had those severe mental illnesses. That is, I think, objectively better than just saying, go live in the streets, live in filth, live in squalor, be potentially dangerous to your communities. Like, am I missing something there?
One other point to consider is that these encampments can also be very violent. So in DC recently, when they cleared the encampments, homeless person died. They were just run over by a truck because people didn't realize that they were living there, right? So if we're doing mass clearings of homelessness, which, as you mentioned, it's over 700 people are homeless, there's a very real risk to human life. And if you want to
relative to what though? Relative to like I guess, and this is where I'm stuck, right? We're saying there's a real risk to removing them off the streets, but isn't there a very real risk for them staying in the streets?
A risk to whom?
To the homeless folks. Like, go back to your gentleman you talked about who lived in DC in 2-3 feet of snow, right? That's you're at risk for freezing to death at night. I mean, we're just deciding, and I hate that we're even saying this out loud, but like, you're deciding how is that person going to die? Potentially get run over by a truck that's trying to clear a homeless encampment, or die in the elements because they were homeless.
Yeah, I guess my main, it's more of a philosophical objection of, I don't want to give the government any more power to use their monopoly on force than they already have, right? Like the government, when it uses its monopoly on force, kills people, injures people, and delights in their monopoly on force. Giving them the opportunity to use that on a vulnerable population is very scary and is not going to lead to private, it's not going to create this utopia where people are off the streets, yes, but what was the cost to get us there? People dying on the streets is absolutely a problem, but the government being able to use their monopoly on force on a vulnerable population, I think, is much more likely to cause widespread harm versus if we look at what we have as the status quo right now, which is the government crowding out private charity, removing some of the government support and instead empowering private charities and making sure that people are individuals who have like a care for the homeless or who don't realize that there's a homeless shelter in their hometown that they could support, making sure that they have information about how they can help homelessness. Because nobody, trust me, when I lived in Arlington, there was one specific homeless man who sat outside of the 7-Eleven where my bus stop was. Every morning he was yelling and he stayed there every day. It did not make my commute to work pleasant, and it was always very nerve-wracking, but I would rather him be able to access help that serves him than just be off the streets, potentially in a harmful.
Well, let me challenge that, Susannah, because like, what if he has a mental break one day, a la what happened, with the Daniel Penny case down in the New York City subway, right? Or Daniel Perry, excuse me, where he stops a homeless man who was having a mental health breakdown, who was saying he was going to kill people on the subway, right? Like, what if he does snap and does kill people? Like, this is where I think a lot of folks, they hear the argument, they hear the I'm not picking on you, but the bleeding heart argument, but they're like, okay, that's great. I am saying this not to be crass, but I don't care because they are potentially putting my family at risk. So it's a matter of, am I going to subjugate myself and my family to more added harm when we didn't do anything? And then there's somebody who, to what we talked about earlier, maybe made a choice in life that was not a good choice, finds themselves here. Does that excuse that now they could potentially harm others?
These are obviously horrible situations that happen. And I'm not saying that there's no violence from, like, homeless individuals never commit violence. That's not at all what I'm saying. But generalizing that to the homeless community is unfair. A lot of people who are homeless are, they are addicted to drugs, they have these mental health problems, but they aren't necessarily violent. And giving nobody a chance because of the potential that someone is going to turn violent is just a sweeping generalization that doesn't do anything to actually fix homelessness. And one thing that I was thinking about.
I'm sorry, I have to push back a little bit there, because that goes back to my concern I had earlier, where it's like, well, are we your concern was, well, what about that one person who got run over by the truck, right, in the homeless encampment? And I guess, if I were to ask you, like, how many people do you think on average, not from government hands, but like just from being homeless, how many people die per year? Do you have a number for that?
I'm not sure, but the example
I looked it up really quick. It was the National Health Care for the Homeless Council. They stated for 2023, the most accurate data they have, they guess between 15,000 and 40,000 people per year die that are homeless. So I'm having trouble getting to the argument, Susannah, saying that we're going to see 15,000 to, we'll say 50,000 people, potentially homeless people, die at government trying to come in and help solve the problem. I'm not saying government's going to be the best solution to the problem, but to hear that number, I think anybody who said, oh my God, 40,000 homeless people, 15,000 homeless people were just murdered by the government and the government agents, like, everybody would freak out. But I don't think that would be the case relative to what we're seeing actually happen, where they are dying in that number on the streets.
I guess I view any death of a person as a tragedy.
Yeah.
But like if they're dying at the force of the government, that's a problem. If they're dying because they can't access care, that's available. That should be available to them. Like there should be private charities that are able to help these people, but government makes it extremely difficult. Both of those are tragedies. Both of those can be true at the same time. My concern, as I said, is
Give the government more power.
I don't want to give the government more power.
Right.
Because I believe that the government, in its monopoly on force, has already been violent against any vulnerable population, and empowering the government to use violence is only going to beget more violence. And so and to your point about the single person who died, that was one homeless encampment clearance. This is very common. The majority of homeless encampment clearances end with some sort of damage to the homeless persons who are in those encampments. So whether that's a severe injury or death, it's very common. So it's not just a one-off case because they involve like dump trucks coming in and clearing out tents and clearing out people's, as kind of difficult to conceptualize as it is, like these are people's possessions. These are things that they have and they're just scooping them out. And frankly, there are places like in DC that you don't know if there's a person living in there or if it's just like a tent or a tarp, and you can try to talk to someone, but maybe you don't know if they're there. And so these people can end up being victims to government violence. And that's something just from my personal ethos, I'm trying to avoid anyone experiencing violence at all, but especially violence on the hands of the government. Well,
and I'm not picking on you here, Susan. I mean, this is the very real conversation that people are having every single day, right? And I think it's important for us to have this dialogue because we need to be able to go back and forth and actually understand the other side. And I guess where I'm really trying to get over this hump here, but like, it kind of goes to the main argument we're hearing right now with like the illegal immigration debate, right? Everybody's freaking out because ICE is going around and having people who are potentially violent criminals in America being sent home. And you look at the whole El Salvador, they're sending over to this ginormous prison in El Salvador, right? And it looks really bad, right? But when you look at the very real outcomes, be it a generalized outcome or not, it is objectively happening. And your average person, Susannah, hears that and says, well, those people, illegal immigrants across the board, right? Again, we're going to generalize because that's how average people think. Those people shouldn't be here to begin with. They cross the border illegally. They already, by the nature of doing that, have broken laws. Therefore, anything that happens after the fact, be it incentivized or not, based on their circumstance or situation, I don't care because they made a choice in doing something that was objectively illegal per our American laws. So you look at the homeless person, that same mentality carries forward, right? Where they say this person, again, we're going to generalize. There are use cases that are exceptions to the rule, to your point, but generalizing, a large majority of these folks either made a negative choice that was either just a bad choice themselves or inherently illegal. They now find themselves in situations where they're living on the streets. And, it comes to well, listen, I want to feel bad for these people, but I can only feel bad to the extent that they feel bad for themselves. And oh, by the way, I'm not going to put my family at risk. I'm not going to put my community at risk to tolerate the fact that we're going to have these large, 2-block long tent encampments for people that could potentially foster disease, could foster violence, could foster SA, like all of these things that are very real and have very real negative consequences. Your average person is seeing this firsthand, which, by the way, also speaks to why during COVID and beyond, there was a flood of people leaving these big cities because as the homeless problem continued to get worse and government continued to abdicate their responsibility, which, again, if I'm ever going to make an argument for government, it is the very basic role of government to stop people from hurting others and taking their stuff. I've seen firsthand in Philadelphia, homeless people rob other people walking down the street. You mentioned the guy screaming at your bus corner. I mean, you put him on a subway, you give him a knife that he finds. I'm sorry, that for anybody on that subway is a very, very real threat to them, be it he's going to do something or just the presence of him being there who could do something. That's not a world that I want to live in. That's not a world that your average person wants to live in. And I think that the tolerance and the again, that bleeding heart mentality, it really is wearing thin on a lot of normal people out there, because they see this and they're like, listen, I can feel sympathy and empathy towards these folks, but like, I have to focus on me and my family and my community first and foremost. I can't always just say, oh, this poor person, I wonder what their circumstance was that got them to here. There comes a point where we have to just like be able to say, hey, this is what happened. This is where this person is. It's sad. It's sad they got to this point, but we need to make our community safer. And it's not making it safer by just enabling them to continue to live on the streets. Yes, I want private alternatives, to your point. I really want that, right? I think that's a really good solution. But if there is one role for government at all, like we're going to live in this society where government exists, I think this is at the very minimum a role that government should be taking. Not like, I'm not asking them to go in and like make these people upstanding citizens in America, but rather just like, hey, let's take them off the streets. Let the nonprofits or the private sector folks do their work, right? Like, again, if it's a homeless mom with her kids, all right, you go to this nonprofit who prioritizes for moms and needing help there. You're clean, you're sober, and you want to get back to work because you fell in hard times. You never were a drug user, and you don't need to commit penalties or crimes rather to get points so we can give you housing. Like, okay, here that goes to that nonprofit. And then the 75% of folks who have some type of mental illness, here we go. We have, 15 different nonprofits and private sector folks who can now go out and help break down these 75% of folks, 500,000+ who are suffering from these issues, and say, okay, you're just a drug addict. Okay, let's you go to this nonprofit. You focus on the drug addict side of things. Oh, you actually have severe mental health issues. Okay, that's a different conversation. Again, going to the nonprofit. So it's not that I'm saying the government needs to have the solution, but government, I think, based on where we are today, should play a role in the solution, unless the government's going to completely say, all right, you know what? We're going to just say no government role at all. We're going to, what's that show? Oh goodness, it's the Purge, right? The Purge, where they like shut down all rules and stuff for like a day, and all crime is legal, right? Almost reverse that mentality. Like, hey, we're just going to say, we're not going to do this anymore. Private sector, private individuals, you deal with it as you see, right? I can almost guarantee that there's going to be a large portion, Susannah, in the private sector who, if the government took that role, they would be way more forceful than the government ever was. And that's another concern I have, is that you're going to almost incentivize people who are saying, you know what? Government's not doing their job, and neither are these private sector things. You know what? We're just going to do it ourselves. I don't think that's going to be a better outcome either. What are your thoughts there?
I mean, I think some of this is just fundamentally like a different view on like the role of government, right? Like, in my view of the homelessness problem, since the war on poverty has only increased. Homelessness has only increased. The government, and it's the same with the war on drugs, it's the same with most abolition efforts by the government. All it does is it makes the problem worse, because the government is just trying to hide the problem. And so you talk about violent people in homeless encampments, drug users in homeless encampments, sexual assault in homeless encampments. These are all common. And some of that is the government not enforcing its laws that already exist, right? Like they aren't touching the homeless population. They're allowing like women and children who live on the streets especially to be vulnerable, LGBT people who live on the streets to be especially vulnerable. And the government doesn't enforce laws. They allow it to be a lawless zone, right? So they've created these places that are dangerous, that are unsafe, because the government doesn't care. Like, fundamentally, they will keep throwing money at problems. It's the same with education, same with healthcare. They won't do the hard work to actually to reduce the homelessness problem, to make education better suited for children, to make healthcare better and make healthcare cheaper for people who need it. The government causing the problem, it's cyclical to then ask the government to be the solution. And so that's my general view on this case, is the government has driven the homelessness problem through rent control, through zoning reform, through strict zoning requirements that make building affordable housing impossible. They have taken away mental health facilities. A lot of those are also zoned out. So people don't, in the cities that need more mental health facilities, they are unable to build them. So urban areas that have more concentrated mental health problems don't have mental health services. They've crowded out private charity. And all of this has exacerbated the homelessness problem to where we are today. So had the government not played a role, I don't think homelessness would look like it does today. And so that's my thinking on this problem is the government maybe could use its monopoly on force, but it's done that in the past, and we haven't seen homelessness go away. We've only seen homelessness increase and homelessness become more of an epidemic, like you called it. And so I just balk at the idea of government being involved in a solution to a problem that they largely created.
So really quick, let's dig into that, because I'm curious. You said that government largely created this issue, but from a solution standpoint, I don't think, and keep me honest here, but I don't think of any government policies that have been implemented over the past 40 years that are, in the ballpark of what I was suggesting here today. Is there something I didn't realize existed, or was there something that government tried to do like this that didn't work?
What I talk about is like encampment clearings. And these have also happened.
But they're not going in. They're not just taking them off the street, though. They're literally clearing the encampments, correct?
They are also taking people off the street. So they move them to temporary housing, and then those people end up back
temporary.
On the streets.
Okay.
Yeah. So the hope is, okay, now you're in a shelter. You're going to go and find a house, and we're going to provide you with tools. But if you talk to the people who work in this, it's the Community Housing Partnership, which is a government private kind of in between. They're the ones who administer the pit count. They talk about, they're like, yeah, we get the people from encampment clearings, but where are we supposed to put them? There's no, there isn't these homeless shelters. They're all gone. A lot have closed. A lot are not, their beds are full. And so where else do they go but the streets or jail? And so if the
mental health facility.
And that goes back to our conversation earlier, right? But that's not the world we live in. So in the world we live in, there isn't places for them to go besides back to the street.
But that's my point, though. And do you hear that? Like that's literally my point, is that the solutions that would be, I think, something that we should consider in many cases aren't allowed because of this mentality.
And I'm not disagreeing with you about providing opportunities for people who are experiencing like severe mental health crises to allow them to be put into care, right? Like providing access to care, regardless of if it is if it's an acute mental health crisis, or if you are a depressed homeless person who needs access to therapy. Those are things that on the more kind of psychosis side, there might need to be more force. But if we're kind of grouping all these people together, someone who has depression and who could be treated by going to one place that I had heard about is in Texas called Mobile Loaves and Fishes, where they house people who had, depression, anxiety, who have more severe mental health problems, who have drug problems, and they put them in communities and give them jobs and give them roles, and they help them recover. Those are also important. There's a spectrum. And so it's not a black and white issue because, again, these are people, these are individuals. And I think that's kind of one of my main calls to action is to go on the pit count. They're in every major city, and even places that don't get federal homeless dollars do them on their own if there's any sort of homelessness problem. Like in Arlington, Virginia, there's about 100 homeless people, right? Like that's a very small number for a large city. People still go and count to make sure that they're able to help those people, put them into shelters, give them access to resources. And so it's really useful to go on these point in time counts and learn about people's stories and learn about why they're homeless, because then you also have the opportunity to help them. Some of the people I spoke to, I actually helped them find a shelter to sleep in for the night. For some, they maybe are just unable to make a phone call to find a shelter to stay in because they don't have a phone. And so that's what I think the benefit of attending a point in time count is you say, okay, wow, I didn't realize it was so difficult to get into a shelter, even if you wanted to. What can I do as a person? Because clearly the government isn't helping people get into shelters. What can I do to make sure that people are able to do that?
So my final thoughts, and I apologize, we went way over time here today.
Okay.
This is a really good conversation. So I was like, we don't get these like back and forths like this. So I'm going to embrace this. But here, I'll do my final thoughts, and then Susannah, I'll turn things over to you to bring us home. But like when you look at the data, and this is where I'm a little stuck, right? Back in New York City, I think it was the late 90s or so, there was a big study done. They found that 40%, or there's a 40 times increase rather of violent crimes being committed from homeless people relative to the normal population. You look at LA in the most recent, I think like the 2020 and onward, 8% of crimes being committed in LA were done by homeless people, despite homeless people only being 1% of the population. So there is, to the average public looking at this, outward facing, they say there is a very real like a very real, I'm going to not say the word threat, but there is a very real danger associated with large encampments and large numbers of homeless people. As those numbers increase, we're only going to see by proportion those metrics increase, right? And I guess this goes back to the kind of the two big points of disagreement you and I have today is that, number one, I hear you, right? They are people. And I acknowledge that. And part of the thing we teach in the show is understanding empathy, right? And the role of walking in someone's shoes, understanding how they got to where they are. But that alone doesn't excuse the behavior, and it doesn't excuse the consequences. You may have had something terrible happen to you in your life, but that terrible thing should not then excuse away other terrible behaviors or circumstances you find yourself in. There does come a point where your average person says, listen, I went through hardship. I went through the mud. I had a tough time in life, and I was able to accomplish X, Y, and Z. Those things that were considered, terrible and detrimental to my life at the time, I was able to overcome those, not, succumbing to those issues, and actually put myself in a better position moving forward. There is a losing of empathy, I think, from that type of person, because we all kind of go through the shit, right? Like, we've all gone through hardships in life, but it's not those hardships that should define us and become our story, but rather things that we look to overcome. To the second point, right? How do we overcome this? If there are so many people who are voluntarily on the streets for whatever reason, and they refuse help, I'm sorry, at that point, in my humble opinion, you've lost the ability to make a smart, intelligent choice for yourself. Because, number one, nobody in their right mind would prefer to be homeless. That's an obvious, I would hope. But number two is that, there are all these other externalities from increased homelessness. And we've walked through a majority of those today. So again, going full circle, I think, Susannah, that the main thing you're going to have to overcome when you're talking to lots of folks out there, and I'm sure you do this on the regular, but like, there is very much this, hey, that's great. I'm sorry. I feel really bad for that person. And again, not saying this to be rude, but like, I just don't care, because I look at how bad certain things have gotten in my city, in my community, in my town. And I'm just like, you know what? That's fine, but we got to do something about this. And I did an episode, probably like a year ago or so, and it was called The Danger of Do Something Politics. But this is where most people get to, is that they're like, listen, if government is supposed to have this role and they're abdicating responsibility, and then we start to try to bring private solutions to the table and they're not able to effectively address the problems, are we just supposed to say, okay, well, this is life? Because it didn't used to be. Right. And this is where a lot of folks, like, we're able to have a long enough memory that we can talk to people who grew up during the 40s and the 50s and into the 60s. And this wasn't America. We didn't see this en masse. Now, I'm not saying that their solution was the best solution, but it was objectively better, I'd argue, relative to what we have today. Which, going back to the point I was trying to raise earlier, like, for every homeless person who is accidentally hurt or horrifyingly killed by government trying to clean up the homeless encampments and the homeless issue we have, I just think if we were to proportionalize that out, it would be a drop in the bucket relative to the almost 40,000 people that die on average yearly who are homeless. And I think we have to, again, go back to, we got to make some hard decisions. And it might not be, our bleeding heart solution. It might not be the most empathetic solution, but we need a solution that is going to actually help put these people in a better spot. Again, objectively speaking, I think it is fair to say you're a better off individual in some type of housing with a roof over your head versus being 2 to 3 feet in the snow or on the streets with thousands of others who are partaking in all sorts of horrific drugs and sharing needles and just the communicable diseases. So that is, at the end of the day, kind of where my position is. And again, I really appreciate you coming on the show and like digging into this, because this is an area where a lot of people are seeing the very real outcomes firsthand. Mm-hmm. A lot of folks live in these big cities, right? And they're wondering, like, what can we do? What should we do? And there is this mentality that has really carried through our American persona of, like, we are this bleeding heart, like, we're going to do what we can for you. We're a melting pot. Nobody's like, no individual person is worse or better than another. But like, we've almost gone so into that mentality that we have refused to acknowledge that there are objective goods and bads. And that's not to say that the good is the best, but it is better relative to what the other options are. And I guess that's kind of where I end today's conversation. So that's my final thoughts, Susannah. I've really, again, appreciated this conversation. Bring us home, your final thoughts. And of course, where can folks go ahead, reach out to you if they want to tell you why I was so wrong and why you were so right. And also follow all your work you're doing there over on social media.
Yeah. So I guess my main takeaway is like, it sucks that the government isn't doing anything, right? Like, I'm a young woman and living in a major metropolitan area. I would love to be able to go out to the bar with my friends and walk to the metro and not be worried about getting harassed or having violence just on a regular Friday night, right? The government isn't going to do something right now, so you should do something right now. If you are concerned about homelessness in your community, then do something. Volunteer at a shelter. Ask people who work in homelessness reduction in your community what you can do. Express your concerns to them. Go on the pick count, right? Like, the government does not face an incentive structure that allows them to do whether you want the bleeding heart reforms or you want the clear homelessness reforms, right? Like, they don't face an incentive structure to do either. We want to avoid an increase in homelessness. And I think that requires individuals being more involved in their communities. And some of this also means being more involved in your friends' lives. Everyone I talked to talked about how they didn't have friends. They didn't have family who supported them when they fell into crisis, right? Check in on your friends. It sounds kind of ridiculous, but if your friend is struggling with a major mental health crisis, you might not know. If your friend has started taking drugs, you might not know. We have to be a community for each other, and that's a key way of avoiding an increase in homelessness. There's data that shows that people who have more friends are less likely to be homeless, and that makes sense. You get evicted, your partner starts hurting you, you have a place to go, and that's what we should all be striving for, is to be more interconnected, because the government doesn't push us to have friends and push us to create community. So that's one way you can actively, like, fight homelessness today, right? Like, we're talking about big picture solutions, bringing it back down to the micro. Like, you have a friend you haven't heard from a little bit, maybe make sure they're doing okay, right? Like, you don't want to find out that your friend is on the streets because you didn't reach out to them and nobody else did. And so that's my main takeaway, right? Like, I love talking about all these macro issues. I thought it was really interesting. It's always fun to disagree. I was on the debate team in high school and college, so I love this. But like, think about the micro, like, reach out to a homeless shelter and see if you can volunteer, or like, just make sure you're checking in on your friends, especially your friends who maybe are going through a hard time, to make sure that they don't turn to drugs, that they don't turn to, that they aren't falling into some sort of mental health crisis. We want to avoid this increase in homelessness. And I loved, Ryan, what you said about, we don't want hardships to define you. And some of that is like having a place to catch you when you face hardship. Mm-hmm. And so making sure that people aren't defined by the hardship that they face is really important. But yeah, those are my takes. You can read other things I write on social mobility, families, economic growth on my Substack, Upward Bound. And then I'm also on Twitter at Susannah Petitt, Pettitt.
Petitt. That's how you say your last name.
It's always Petite. And when I met my husband, I thought it was Petite, and I thought that was really fun. But so I always am fine with the Petite, because I think it's more fun than Pettit. But
Susannah, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I'll just confess to the audience, as much as I like, people agreeing with me, it's nice to have the back and forth, because this is the real conversation that people are having at the dinner table, right? And frankly, this is the real conversations that we as a society need to be having. It's one thing to acknowledge there's a problem. It's another thing to actually start talking about real solutions. And sometimes those solutions are going to be no-brainers. Other times they're going to be a little convoluted. And that's why we need to have these conversations, to really flesh out ideas and let them win in the marketplace of ideas. So Susannah, I really appreciate you coming on the show, dealing with my slings and arrows. And folks, if you really enjoyed Susannah's commentary, please do me a favor. Go ahead, give her some love. Let her know you heard her here on the Brian Nichols Show, and go follow her work. Other than that being said, folks, if you enjoyed today's episode, please go ahead and give it a share. When you do, tag yours truly at B Nichols Liberty. But with that being said, we're going to go ahead and put a pin in today's conversation. Brian Nichols signing off here on the Brian Nichols Show for Susannah Petitt. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Brian Nichols Show. Find more episodes at briannicholsshow.com.